Welcome to Tech Blueprint, a window that lets you know the latest technology news in the world. In recent years, the United States has aggressively imposed chip restrictions on mainland China, significantly impacting not only domestic Chinese wafer manufacturers, but also foreign-owned wafer fabs in mainland China. For example, they are unable to purchase ASML's EUV lithography machines. Furthermore, after the US issued its strictest export controls in 2022, mainland Chinese wafer fabs were restricted from purchasing advanced foreign equipment. However, companies like Samsung quickly obtained US exemptions. Now that US approvals have changed again, Korean companies are facing even greater difficulties. At the time, Samsung, SK hynix, and TSMC were able to quickly obtain US exemptions because they responded to US demands and actively invested in and built factories there. The US also wanted them to accelerate their progress, so they had to give them some face. Furthermore, Samsung and SK hynix's operations in mainland China are primarily memory wafer fabs, and TSMC's wafer fab in Nanjing is not advanced in terms of process technology. Therefore, they were granted a temporary one-year exemption, but this did not solve the actual problem. Because of the one-year exemption, Samsung and other Chinese wafer fabs are hesitant to expand production. It wasn't until a year later, after the US government granted a permanent exemption, that Samsung, SK hynix, and TSMC felt confident in expanding their wafer fabs in China. They no longer worried about equipment purchase restrictions midway through expansion. However, less than 2 years after the permanent exemption, US policy shifted again. First, Samsung and SK hynix were removed from the Verified End-User (VEU) list, and TSMC was soon notified. This meant that their permanent exemptions would only last until the end of this year, with their license exemptions revoked starting next year. Once their exemptions were revoked, their operations in China would be severely disrupted. The US stated that the revocation of licenses primarily prohibited their wafer fabs in China from expanding or upgrading their technology, while ensuring that their existing plants could continue to operate. However, this would also affect the normal operations of Samsung and other wafer fabs in China, as they need to apply for licenses on a case-by-case basis to purchase US-made semiconductor manufacturing equipment or materials. Crucially, the speed with which the relevant US authorities review these licenses is appalling. The US Department of Commerce is currently facing a significant surge in license applications, reportedly the highest number in over 3 decades. To address this issue, Samsung and TSMC have stated that they will actively communicate with the US government and strive to ensure uninterrupted operations at their wafer fabs in China. However, this is not easy, as the production process consumes a large number of components and chemicals. According to US media reports, given the current high volume of license applications, the US is exploring a solution. In response to the recent revocation of licenses for Samsung, SK hynix, and TSMC's wafer fabs in China, an additional 1,000 license applications will be processed. Even this may not solve the problem, as previously no license applications were required. Now they are being applied on a case-by-case basis. Since Trump's re-election, under the threat of US tariffs, Not only has TSMC quickly pledged an additional $100 billion in U.S. investment, but South Korean companies Samsung and SK hynix have also expanded their U.S. investments and accelerated wafer fab construction. Under these circumstances, the U.S. may not want to overreact. Consequently, Bloomberg recently reported that the U.S. government is considering a centralized annual approval process for manufacturing equipment and materials needed by South Korean companies Samsung and SK hynix for their wafer fabs in China. In other words, the U.S. government plans to convert the exemptions granted to Samsung and SK hynix's wafer fabs in China into licenses valid until the end of the year. U.S. media outlets suggest this move is primarily a compromise to revoke their exemptions. However, reports citing sources familiar with the matter indicate that the U.S. proposal has caused both relief and frustration among South Korean industry and government officials. While it provides a way for South Korean companies to continue operating their wafer fabs in China, it also complicates their production processes. According to the U.S. proposal, South Korean companies would need to submit a single application for approval of all equipment, parts, and materials needed for a year, specifying the specific quantities required. However, companies simply cannot predict what parts and materials they will need in the coming year, or how much. Just imagine, how could a company know which equipment and locations will malfunction within the next year, and what parts will be needed for repairs? Without a clear list of the required parts, approvals would be delayed, and production would remain disrupted. In response, some foreign media outlets have directly stated that the U.S. proposal has made things even more difficult for South Korean companies. While the U.S. government, under the guise of preventing disruption to the global electronics industry, has actually increased regulatory complexity and impacted the normal operations of South Korean wafer fabs in China, it is reportedly in negotiations with the U.S. on this matter. However, it seems the U.S. proposal is the best that can be achieved.